When SEAL Team 6 was surrounded in the Afghan mountains, radio contact lost and ammo nearly gone, the silence was broken by a single breath. Hers. Lieutenant Avery Hale, callsign Ghost, the only female sniper in the unit, crawled through the snow under moonlight, heartbeat synced with the enemy's steps. As her brothers in arms bled out in the ravine below, she steadied her rifle. One shot could save them or expose her. When the trigger broke the night, the world finally learned why they called her Ghost. The Hindu Kush Mountains held no mercy at 11,000 feet. Lieutenant Avery Hale pressed her body against the frozen ridgeline, her breath forming crystalline clouds that dissipated into the Afghanistan night. Through her night vision scope, the world appeared in shades of green, the rocky terrain, the scattered pines bent by wind, and 800 meters below, the compound where SEAL Team 6 had walked into hell. Ghost, this is Hawk. We're pinned down. Radio's dying. Need eyes on the ridge. The voice crackled through her earpiece, Commander Mason Carter's usual calm fraying at the edges. Avery adjusted her position behind the M110 semi-automatic sniper system, her gloved fingers finding familiar purchase on the weapon that had become an extension of herself. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, cold enough to affect ballistics, cold enough to make her calculations more complex. Ghost copies. I count 12 tangos on your 6, another 8 moving in from the northwest. She spoke quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding below. You've got maybe 3 minutes before they close the circle. The mission had been straightforward on paper. Extract Dr. Samuel Morrison, an American geophysicist captured 3 weeks ago while surveying mineral deposits near the Pakistan border. Intelligence suggested he was being held by a splinter Taliban group in a compound 20 clicks from the nearest forward operating base. Quick in, quick out. Except intelligence had failed to mention the 50 additional fighters who'd arrived 2 days earlier. Now Mason and his 7-man team were trapped in a stone building with limited ammunition, facing an enemy that had both numbers and position. Avery had watched it unfold from her overwatch position, had seen the ambush spring shut like a bear trap, had counted the muzzle flashes that meant her teammates were fighting for their lives. Can you give us a path? Mason's question carried weight. They both knew what he was really asking. Could she kill enough of them to create an escape route? Avery scanned the compound through her scope. Tangos were moving with tactical precision, using cover, advancing in pairs, while others provided suppression fire. These weren't ragtag insurgents. Someone down there had military training, probably former Afghan army who'd switched sides when the money dried up. Negative on a clear path, she reported. They're too dispersed. I can thin them out, but the moment I fire, they'll know there's an overwatch. They'll either rush your position or come for me. Then we sit tight and wait for QRF. Quick reaction force. Help that was at least 40 minutes away, assuming the helicopters could navigate the mountain passes in this weather. Hawk, you don't have 40 minutes. Avery's scope settled on a fighter carrying an RPG-7, moving toward a position that would give him a clear shot at the building. You've got incoming. RPG, northeast corner. She didn't wait for confirmation. Her finger found the trigger, the familiar squeeze, the rifle's recoil absorbed by her shoulder. Through the scope, she watched the RPG fighter drop, the launcher clattering on stone, 783 meters, wind from the west at 8 knots. Perfect shot. The compound erupted. Fighters scrambled for cover, unsure where the shot had originated. Avery was already acquiring her next target, a fighter with a radio, probably their commander. Another squeeze, another body falling. Ghost, you just painted a target on yourself, Mason said, but there was relief in his voice. The immediate threat had been neutralized. Just doing my job, Hawk. Avery chambered another round, her eyes never leaving the scope. She'd bought them time, but time was a currency that spent quickly in combat. Below, muzzle flashes lit up the night as the enemy returned fire toward the ridgeline, their bullets striking rocks 50 meters from her position. They knew she was up here now. They just didn't know exactly where. That uncertainty was her only advantage, and it wouldn't last long. In her earpiece, she could hear the strained breathing of her teammates, the occasional burst of gunfire, the terse communications that meant they were rationing ammunition. Petty Officer Dylan Chase's voice cut through. Hawk, Sullivan's hit, leg wound, arterial. He needs a medic now. Avery's jaw tightened. Kevin Sullivan. The kid from Texas who joined Team 6 8 months ago, who still got nervous before missions despite his flawless performance record, who'd asked her just yesterday if she missed civilian life, if she ever thought about leaving all this behind. She'd told him no, that this was exactly where she belonged. Now he was bleeding out in a compound 800 meters away, and her rifle, for all its precision and power, couldn't stop an arterial bleed. "QRF is still 35 minutes out," Mason said quietly. And Avery heard what he didn't say. Sullivan didn't have 35 minutes. The wind shifted, carrying with it the sound of voices below Pashto, urgent commands, the distinctive metallic sounds of weapons being loaded. Through her scope, she watched the fighters regrouping, organizing for either an assault on the building or a hunt for her position. Maybe both. Avery's mind raced through scenarios, calculating odds and outcomes. She had 43 rounds remaining. The enemy had at least 20 fighters, probably more in reserve. Darkness was her ally, but dawn would break in 3 hours, and with daylight came helicopters, theirs, not ours. The Taliban might lack sophisticated weapons, but they'd learned from 15 years of war. They knew how to pin down American forces until reinforcements arrived, how to turn a rescue operation into a body recovery mission. Her radio crackled. "Ghost," Mason's voice, lower now, meant only for her. "If this goes south, you break contact and get to the extraction point. That's an order. With respect, Commander, I don't take orders from dead men." Avery's response was sharp, sharper than she'd intended. "And you're not dying in that compound. None of you are." A brief silence, then Mason's dry chuckle. "That's why they call you Ghost. You're too stubborn to accept reality." "Reality is negotiable," Avery said, her scope tracking a fighter who was moving with too much confidence, weapon slung, carrying something. She zoomed in, a mortar tube. "Reality just changed. They've got indirect fire capability. Mortar team setting up, 200 meters east of your position." She fired twice in quick succession. 2 fighters dropped. The mortar tube fell, useless now without its crew. But more fighters were rushing to recover it, and Avery knew this was a losing game. For every one she killed, 2 more appeared from the darkness. The temperature continued to drop. Her fingers were beginning to stiffen despite the gloves. Below, her teammates were running out of ammunition, running out of time, running out of options. And somewhere in that compound, Dr. Morrison, if he was still alive, was waiting for a rescue that might never come. Avery pressed her eye back to the scope, her breath steadying, her heart rate dropping to that calm place she'd learned to find in moments of crisis. The place where fear couldn't reach her, the place where only the shot mattered. "Hawk," she said quietly, "I'm going to need you to trust me." Number Part 2, The Ghost's Origin. 3 years earlier, Camp Pendleton had been sweltering under a California sun when Avery first fired the shot that would change her life. Not in combat in the qualifying trials for the Naval Special Warfare Command Sniper program, a course so demanding that fewer than 30% of candidates completed it. She'd been Avery Morrison then, a Navy EOD technician with a flawless service record and a chip on her shoulder the size of the Pacific. Her husband, Marine Captain Ryan Morrison, had died 6 months earlier in Syria, not in combat, but in a training accident that should never have happened. Faulty equipment, budget cuts, bureaucratic negligence dressed up as operational mishap. Ryan had been her world. High school sweethearts from a small town in Oregon, they joined the military together, believing in service and sacrifice. His death had shattered something in Avery, had burned away everything soft and left only hard edges and a singular purpose: to become so good at her job that no one could question her place, her value, her right to be there. The sniper program had seemed impossible. She was 5'6", weighed 130 soaking wet, and was attempting to enter a community that had never selected a woman for SEAL Team 6. The instructors made their skepticism clear from day one. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb had been the worst. A 20-year veteran with 3 deployments and a chest full of medals, he'd looked at Avery like she was a diversity quota come to life. "Mrs. Morrison," he'd said on the first day, deliberately using her married name though she wore no ring. "This isn't a regular sniper course. This is for operators who'll be taking shots in conditions you can't imagine, under pressure that will break most men. No one here cares about your feelings or your gender. If you can't hack it, drop out now and save us all time." Avery had looked him in the eye and said, "With respect, Chief, I'm not here for your approval. I'm here to become the best sniper this program has ever produced." Webb had smiled, not kindly. "We'll see." The physical training had been brutal. Endless ruck marches with 80-pound packs, obstacle courses designed to destroy joints and spirits, swims in cold ocean water that turned lips blue and muscles to concrete. Avery had been smaller than every man there, weaker by objective measures of strength. so she'd simply refused to quit. When her body screamed for rest, she'd thought of Ryan. When instructors yelled that she was slowing down the class, she'd run faster. When they suggested subtly at first, then overtly that she should drop out for the good of the team, she'd shown up the next morning before anyone else. The shooting had been where she'd excelled. Avery had grown up hunting with her father in the Oregon woods, had that rare gift of instinctive marksmanship that couldn't be taught. She understood wind and distance, could calculate trajectories in her head, possessed the patience to wait hours for the perfect shot. In the stalking exercises where candidates had to crawl within 200 meters of instructors without being spotted, she'd earned the highest scores in her class. Webb had started calling her Ghost after she'd managed to get within 50 meters of his position during a training exercise, so close he'd found her boot print in the sand after the drill ended. Like a damn ghost, he'd muttered, equal parts annoyed and impressed. The name had stuck, but acceptance hadn't come easily. The other candidates had kept their distance, unsure how to treat her. Some were overtly hostile, making comments about political correctness and lowered standards. Others were awkwardly polite, as if afraid that acknowledging her existence might be seen as weakness. Only one candidate had treated her like an equal from the start, Mason Carter, already a SEAL Team 6 operator cross-training to improve his long-range capabilities. Mason was 34, a veteran of 8 deployments, with a calm intensity that commanded respect without demanding it. Where others saw Avery's gender, Mason saw her capabilities. "You've got the best win calls in the class," he told her after a particularly difficult shooting evolution. "And your stalking techniques are solid. Don't let the politics get in your head." "I don't have time for politics," Avery had replied. "I have time for being better than everyone else." Mason had laughed. "There's the attitude that'll get you through." They'd become friends, training partners who pushed each other to excellence. Mason taught her the tactical thinking that separated military snipers from competitive shooters, how to choose positions not just for visibility but for escape routes, how to read enemy movement patterns, how to make decisions when there was no perfect shot and lives hung in the balance. In return, Avery had brought a level of precision to her shooting that impressed even the instructors. She'd graduated top of her class, the first woman to complete the Naval Special Warfare Sniper program, and the first to be considered for assignment to SEAL Team 6's intelligence support team. That consideration had triggered a firestorm of debate. SEAL Team 6 didn't have female operators. The combat exclusion policy had been lifted years earlier, but actually integrating women into the most elite unit in the American military was another matter entirely. Committees formed, risk assessments were conducted, politicians weighed in. Avery had ignored all of it. She'd simply shown up every day, qualified expert on every weapon system, passed every physical evaluation, and made it clear through her performance that she belonged. Finally, Vice Admiral James Hendricks, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, had made the call. Lieutenant Morrison will be assigned to SEAL Team 6 as a precision marksman, attached to Commander Carter's unit for operational evaluation. If she performs, she stays. If not, she's gone. Merit, not politics. That had been 18 months ago. Since then, Avery had deployed 4 times, twice to Afghanistan, once to Syria, once to Yemen. She'd taken 37 confirmed kills, all of them legitimate targets verified by intelligence and legal review. She'd saved countless lives through precision fire and tactical intelligence, and slowly, grudgingly, the team had accepted her, not because she was a woman proving herself in a man's world, but because she was a professional who did her job with excellence, who had their backs when it mattered, who understood that in combat there was no room for anything but competence and trust. Mason had become more than a friend. He'd become her commanding officer, her mentor, and the closest thing she had to family after Ryan's death. It was Mason who'd insisted she take time off after a particularly difficult mission in Syria, where she'd been forced to take a shot through a window where civilians were present. The intelligence had been solid, the target confirmed, the shot necessary. But Avery had still seen their faces in her scope, had still calculated the angles to ensure only the target fell. "This job eats you from the inside if you let it," Mason had told her over coffee at a cafe near the base. "You can't carry every decision like it's a death sentence. You made the right call, and people are alive because of it. People are dead because of it too," Avery had replied. "The right people." Mason's voice had been firm. "We don't fight wars because we want to. We fight them because evil exists. And sometimes the only language evil understands is violence. You're one of the few people I'd trust to apply that violence with precision and judgment. Don't lose sight of that." Those words had stayed with Avery, had helped her navigate the moral complexity of being a sniper. Every shot was a life ended, but often it was also lives saved. The soldiers who didn't walk into an ambush, the civilians who weren't targeted by a bomb maker, the hostages who made it home because someone could take a 1,000-meter shot in adverse conditions. Ryan would have understood. He'd been the one who'd encouraged her to join EOD, to push beyond traditional roles, to prove that capability mattered more than gender. His death had been senseless, a waste of talent and potential. But Avery had decided that her life wouldn't be wasted. She would be so good at her job that when her time came in this line of work, that time came for everyone. Eventually no one could say she hadn't earned her place. Ghost wasn't just a call sign, it was a promise. She would be the unseen protector, the silent guardian, the precision instrument that made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. And now, 3 years after qualifying, 18 months after joining Team 6, she was lying on a frozen ridgeline in Afghanistan, facing the biggest test of her career. Her teammates were trapped, her commander was wounded, and she was the only thing standing between them and a very ugly ending. The Ghost's origin story had prepared her for this moment. Now came the part where she proved whether that preparation was enough. 72 hours before the ambush, the mission briefing had taken place in a secure operations room at Forward Operating Base Chapman. The room smelled of stale coffee and stress, its walls covered with maps and satellite imagery, its air thick with the tension that preceded dangerous operations. Commander Mason Carter had stood at the front, clicker in hand, his weathered face illuminated by the projection screen. Around the table sat 8 operators, including Avery, each representing thousands of hours of training and multiple deployments. These weren't kids playing soldier. These were professionals who understood that every briefing might be the last time they were all together. "Gentlemen and lady," Mason had begun with a nod toward Avery, "we have a Priority 1 extraction. Dr. Samuel Morrison, American geophysicist, age 53, captured 3 weeks ago near Jalalabad." The screen had displayed a photograph of Morrison's salt and pepper hair, kind eyes, the slightly disheveled look of someone more comfortable with rocks than people. Avery had noticed he wore a wedding ring. Dr. Morrison was surveying rare earth mineral deposits for a State Department contract when his security team was ambushed. 3 contractors killed, Morrison taken. Intelligence suggests he's being held here. Mason had clicked to a satellite image approximately 20 clicks from the Pakistani border. Compound fortified but not heavily defended. Best intelligence shows maybe 15 fighters. Lieutenant Jack Reeves, the team's breacher, had frowned. 3 weeks is a long time. What's the intelligence source? Signal intercept confirmed by human intelligence on the ground, Mason had replied. Morrison is alive, being held for ransom. Taliban splinter group, not particularly sophisticated. They're negotiating with state. But you know how that goes. Everyone had known. Negotiations meant delays, bureaucracy, and sometimes prisoners ended up dead while diplomats argued over terms. Direct action was cleaner, faster, and far more final. Timing. This from Chief Petty Officer Tom Bradford, the team medic whose steady hands had saved more lives than most doctors. 72 hours from now. New moon, minimal ambient light. Weather window opens for 8 hours before the next storm system moves in. Mason had clicked through reconnaissance photos. Standard layout outer wall, main building, guard towers on the corners. Dr. Morrison is being held in the eastern section, 2nd floor. Avery had studied the images, her mind already calculating sightlines and firing positions. What about Overwatch? Mason had smiled slightly. I was getting to that, Ghost. You'll insert 12 hours early. Take position here. He'd indicated a ridgeline overlooking the compound and provide precision fire support during the extraction. Designate targets. Cover our approach and egress. Alone? Petty Officer Dylan Chase had asked, concern evident in his voice. Dylan was 28, built like a linebacker, and had appointed himself Avery's unofficial protector despite her repeated insistence she didn't need one. She's trained for solo operations, Mason had said firmly. And frankly, she's better than anyone else here at long-range work. Questions? Avery had leaned forward, pointing at the satellite image. These guard towers. What's the intel on their discipline? Do they rotate regularly, or are we looking at board sentries? Good question. Intel suggests low discipline. These aren't professional soldiers, just local fighters supplementing income. But don't underestimate them. Motivated amateurs can be just as deadly as professionals. The briefing had continued for another hour. Contingency plans, communication protocols, emergency extraction points, rules of engagement. Mason was thorough. He always was making sure every operator knew not just their own role but everyone else's. Cross-training meant if someone went down, the mission could still succeed. After the formal briefing ended, Mason had pulled Avery aside as the others filed out. "You okay with this?" he'd asked quietly. "Solo Overwatch in hostile territory?" Avery had raised an eyebrow. "It's basically my dream assignment." "I'm serious, Avery. This is a long solo insertion. 12 hours alone in enemy territory before we even arrive. If something goes wrong before we get there, you're on your own." "I'm always on my own, Hawk. That's kind of the point of being a sniper." Mason had studied her face, and she'd seen the concern there. Not the condescending worry some operators showed toward her, but genuine concern for a teammate facing danger. "Ryan was my friend too," Mason had said softly. "I know what drives you. Just make sure you're doing this for the right reasons." "The right reason is bringing Dr. Morrison home and making sure my team comes back alive," Avery had replied. "Everything else is noise." Mason had nodded slowly. "If we get cornered, if things go completely wrong, you make the call. Whether that means risking yourself to cover our escape or breaking contact to survive. I trust your judgment." "That's a hell of a responsibility, Hawk. That's why I'm giving it to you and not someone else." Mason had clapped her shoulder. "Get some rest. You'll need it." The next 48 hours had been spent in preparation. Avery had meticulously checked her equipment, rifle, ammunition, optics, survival gear, emergency medical supplies. She'd studied the terrain from every available angle, memorizing elevations and distances, identifying primary and alternate positions. She'd reviewed weather forecasts, wind patterns, temperature projections that would affect her ballistics. The night before insertion, the team had gathered informally in the mess hall. These pre-mission gatherings were tradition, a way to remind themselves they were more than just operators with call signs. They were human beings with lives beyond the battlefield. Kevin Sullivan, the youngest team member, had been nervous despite his efforts to hide it. This was his first hostage extraction operation, and the weight of that responsibility showed in his forced jokes and fidgeting hands. "Ghost," he'd said, sliding into the seat next to Avery. "Can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "Do you ever think about leaving? Going back to civilian life, having a normal existence where people aren't trying to kill you?" Avery had considered the question carefully. "Every day," she'd admitted. "But then I remember why I'm here. Ryan died because someone wasn't good enough at their job. I'm here to be so good that when my team needs me, I don't fail them. That's worth more than comfort or safety." "You really loved him, didn't you?" "I still do." Avery had taken a sip of terrible military coffee. "Love doesn't stop just because someone's gone. It just changes shape, becomes fuel instead of warmth." Sullivan had nodded slowly, processing this. "My girlfriend wants me to leave SEAL teams. Says she can't handle the stress of not knowing if I'm alive." "What do you want?" "I want to be someone who does things that matter. Someone who makes a difference." He'd looked at her directly. "Like you." Avery had smiled, a rare genuine expression. "Then tell her that. And if she can't accept it, find someone who can. Life's too short for people who make you smaller." Now, frozen on a ridgeline with her team trapped below, Avery remembered that conversation. Sullivan was bleeding out from an arterial wound, his young life hemorrhaging into Afghan soil while she calculated wind speed and trajectory. Mason's words echoed in her mind. "You make the call." The call. Right. As if there was a decision to be made. As if she could live with herself knowing she'd had the skills to save them and chosen safety instead. The Ghost hadn't survived this long by making safe choices. She'd survived by being better, faster, and more willing to risk everything than anyone else. Time to prove it. The ambush had sprung with the timing of a well-rehearsed trap. SEAL Team 6 had approached the compound using a wadi, a dry riverbed that provided cover from the guard towers. Mason had led the stack, moving with the fluid precision of operators who'd worked together for years. Behind him came Reeves and Sullivan, then Bradford with his medical pack, followed by the others. Through her scope from the ridgeline above, Avery had watched their approach with growing unease. Something felt wrong. The compound was too quiet, the guards too relaxed. Intelligence had said 15 fighters, but she was counting at least 20 heat signatures through her thermal scope. and more seemed to be arriving from the surrounding buildings. "Hawk, I'm seeing more targets than expected," she'd radioed. "Recommend holding position for reassessment." "Negative, Ghost. We have a limited weather window and Morrison's intel suggests immediate danger." "We proceed." Avery had wanted to argue, to insist they abort, but Mason was the commander and his logic was sound. Intelligence was never perfect. Every mission involved risk. And somewhere in that compound, Doc Morrison was counting on them. The team had reached the outer wall when the night had exploded. Ambushes succeed through overwhelming firepower in the crucial first seconds, and this one had been textbook. Fighters had emerged from hidden positions behind false walls, from underground tunnels, from buildings they'd thought were empty. Machine gun fire had raked the wadi from 3 directions simultaneously, tracers drawing lines of death through the darkness. Avery had watched in horror as her teammates had scrambled for cover, returning fire even as bullets chewed through the ground around them. Mason had made the decision instantly forward into the compound, offered better cover than retreating across open ground. The team had breached through the outer wall using explosive charges, disappearing into a stone building as fire intensified around them. "Ghost, Sitrep," Mason had called, his voice tight with controlled adrenaline. "You've got 12. No, 15 tangos outside the building, more closing from the north and west. This was planned, Hawk. They knew you were coming." "Understood. Can you suppress?" Avery had already been firing. Her first shot had taken down a fighter positioning an RPG. Her second had hit someone who'd been directing others, probably a commander. Her third and fourth had targeted a machine gun team that had been pouring fire into the building. But for every target she eliminated, others took their place. This wasn't a ragtag group defending territory. This was a coordinated military response. And that meant something far worse than a simple ambush. Betrayal. Someone had leaked the mission details. "Hawk, you need to get to the extraction point. This compound is compromised. We came for Morrison. We're not leaving without him." Through the building's windows, she'd seen muzzle flashes as her team returned fire. They'd found defensive positions, solid stone walls, elevation on the second floor, good sight lines. But they were trapped, surrounded by an enemy that had both numbers and reinforcement capability. That's when Sullivan had been hit. Avery had heard the gasp through the radio, followed by Bradford's urgent voice, "I need hands. Sullivan's down. Femoral artery. Femoral artery." In combat medicine, that was nearly a death sentence without immediate intervention. Bradford was one of the best combat medics in naval special warfare, but even he couldn't work miracles with a major arterial bleed under fire. "How bad?" Mason's voice had carried forced calm. "Bad enough. I need time to work, and we need to get him out of here in under 30 minutes or he's gone." 30 minutes. The quick reaction force was still 45 minutes away, assuming the helicopters could even reach them through the mountain passes. Avery had felt time compressing, turning into an enemy as deadly as the fighters below. She'd continued firing methodical, precise shots that kept the enemy's heads down and bought her team seconds that turned into minutes. But ammunition was finite, and eventually even the best sniper became just another target once their position was compromised. Then came the sound that changed everything, the distinctive thump of mortar tubes being dropped into position. "Hawk, they're setting up indirect fire. Mortars, 200 meters east of your position." Mortars meant they could drop explosive shells directly onto the building without exposing themselves to return fire. Stone walls that stopped bullets became coffins when high explosives detonated inside them. Avery had shifted her aim, finding the mortar team. 2 fighters, one dropping rounds into the tube, the other adjusting elevation. She'd taken them both down before they could fire, but more fighters were already running toward the abandoned weapon. This was deteriorating rapidly. The enemy had them fixed in place, was bringing up heavier weapons, and had proven they could replace losses faster than she could create them. Basic military math said SEAL Team 6 was losing, and losing meant dying. "Ghost, we need options." Mason's voice had remained steady, but she'd heard the stress underneath. A commander asking his sniper for options meant the situation had become desperate. Avery had scanned the compound through her scope, her tactical mind processing possibilities. The wadi they'd used to approach now covered by machine gun fire. The northern approach heavy enemy presence. The western route open ground that would turn into a killing field. Every conventional escape route was closed. Then her scope had passed over the eastern wall of the compound, and she'd seen it. A section where the stonework had collapsed, creating a gap maybe 4 feet wide. It opened onto a steep slope that dropped into another wadi, one that curved north toward the extraction point. Difficult terrain, exposed for maybe 30 seconds during the crossing, but possible. Hawk, I've got a route. Eastern wall, collapsed section, leads to a wadi that gives you cover most of the way to extraction point Delta. That's a 100-meter sprint across open ground while carrying a wounded man. It's also your only option unless you want to wait for the mortars. Silence on the radio as Mason calculated odds and alternatives. Then, we'll need covering fire. Heavy covering fire. I can do that. Ghost, there are at least 20 fighters between us and that wall. You'll have to engage all of them simultaneously to keep their heads down. That's not a sniper shot. That's suppression fire. And you're not equipped for. I know what I'm equipped for. Avery had interrupted. Get your team ready to move. When I start shooting, you run and don't stop. Understand? Another pause. Then Mason's voice, carrying something she'd rarely heard from him. Doubt. Avery, if you do this, they'll localize your position immediately. Every fighter down there will converge on your location. Then I'd better make my shots count. She'd chambered a fresh magazine, 20 rounds of match-grade ammunition. On my mark, Hawk. And Hawk? Get Sullivan home. That's an order from his ghost. She'd heard Mason's quiet exhale, the sound of a commander accepting a terrible necessary sacrifice. Copy that. Ghost. We'll be ready. Avery had settled into her position, slowing her breathing, finding that quiet place where fear couldn't reach. She'd surveyed the compound one last time, identifying targets, calculating sequence, planning her shooting pattern to create maximum disruption. 20 rounds, 20 targets, and then whatever came after. Through her scope, she'd watched her team stacking by the building's door, Bradford supporting Sullivan, the others providing security. They were depending on her, not because she was extraordinary, but because this was her job, and she'd sworn to do it with excellence. Ryan's face had flashed through her mind, not as he'd looked when she'd last seen him alive, but as he'd appeared in her dreams after his death, smiling, proud, telling her without words that she was exactly where she needed to be. Ghost to Hawk. Execute on my first shot. She'd placed her crosshairs on the first target, a fighter with a machine gun who would be the greatest threat during the sprint. Her finger had found the trigger, that familiar pressure point between action and consequence. For those who fight unseen, she'd whispered, a prayer and a promise. Then Avery had pulled the trigger, and the night had erupted into chaos. The first shot had been perfect. The machine gunner had dropped instantly, his weapon clattering on stone. Before his body had fully fallen, Avery's bolt was cycling, her scope tracking to the next target. A fighter emerging from a doorway with an RPG down. Another aiming at the building from behind a vehicle down. A fourth directing others down. 4 seconds. 4 kills. 4 rounds expended. Through her peripheral vision, she'd seen her team burst from the building, Bradford half carrying Sullivan, the others providing covering fire as they sprinted toward the collapsed eastern wall. But her focus had remained locked on the scope, on the methodical work of creating enough chaos to give them a chance. 5th target, a fighter running toward the building down. 6th, someone taking position with a rifle down. 7th, a figure shouting commands down. The enemy had reacted exactly as she'd predicted, scattering for cover, trying to identify the source of shots that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. Her position on the ridgeline, elevated and offset, created acoustic confusion. They knew someone was shooting, but pinpointing the exact location took precious seconds they didn't have. 8th round. 9th. 10th. Halfway through her magazine, and her team had reached the wall. They were through, disappearing into the wadi beyond, and for a brief moment, Avery had felt the surge of relief they'd made it out of the immediate kill zone. Then her 11th shot had grazed instead of killing. The bullet had caught a fighter in the shoulder instead of center mass, spinning him around but not dropping him. And in that moment of wounded surprise, the fighter had looked up, following the trajectory, his eyes finding the ridgeline where a muzzle flash had briefly illuminated the night. He'd screamed something in Pashto, pointing, and suddenly every weapon in the compound had swung toward her position. Ghost, break contact. Mason's voice in her earpiece. Urgent now. We're clear. Get out of there. But Avery's scope had found more targets. The fighters pouring out of buildings to pursue her team. She had 9 rounds left. 9 chances to ensure the people she'd sworn to protect made it to safety. 12th shot, a fighter climbing into a technical truck, mounted with a heavy machine gun. 13th, someone who'd reached a radio. 14th, a figure who'd been flanking toward the wadi where her team had disappeared. Bullets were striking around her now, ricochets whining off rocks, dirt kicking up in lethal fountains. The enemy had localized her position and was concentrating fire. She had maybe 30 seconds before someone with an RPG or a mortar got a clean shot. Ghost, that's an order. Extract now. 15, 16, 17. 3 rounds left, and through her scope, Avery had seen the fighter who'd spotted her position grabbing what looked like a radio. Not just any radio, military grade, the kind that could call in reinforcements or artillery support. If he made that call, her team's escape route would be cut off before they reached the extraction point. The decision had formed instantly, without conscious thought. She could take the shot, eliminate the threat, but it would require shifting position slightly, exposing herself for another second. Or she could immediately break contact, retreat to safety, and hope her team could outrun whatever response that radio call brought. Mathematics of sacrifice, calculus of war. Avery had adjusted her position, found the target, and fired. The radio operator had dropped, but in shifting position, she'd silhouetted herself against the sky for a fraction of a second. It had been enough. A burst of machine gun fire had raked across her position, one round striking her rifle's scope, spiderwebbing the lens and rendering it useless. Another had grazed her left shoulder, a line of fire that told her the next burst would find center mass. 2 rounds left. Damaged scope, position completely compromised. Ghost, sitrep, scopes damaged, taking fire. I'm moving. Avery had rolled away from her position as another burst had chewed through the space she'd just occupied. Her shoulder burned, but the wound felt superficial. The bullet had carved a groove rather than penetrating. Painful but not incapacitating. She'd scrambled 20 meters to her secondary position, a shallow depression in the rocks she'd identified during her initial reconnaissance. Less visibility, worse angles, but cover from the direct fire pouring onto the ridgeline. Behind her, she could hear voices, fighters climbing the slope, coming for her. Through her damaged scope, she'd tried to acquire targets, but the fractured lens made precision impossible. She had iron sights, but at these distances, against moving targets in darkness, iron sights were nearly useless. I'm combat ineffective, she'd reported, the hardest words a professional could say. Scope destroyed, multiple tangos closing on my position. Can you reach extraction point Delta? Avery had looked toward where the map said the extraction point lay 3 kilometers of rough terrain, probably with fighters between her and safety. Carrying a damaged rifle and wearing gear that weighed 40 pounds, with an injured shoulder and enemies actively hunting her. Possible? Yes. Likely? That was a different question. Negative, they'll cut me off before I can reach it. Then find cover and go to ground. We'll come back for you. Hawk, you have a wounded man who needs immediate evacuation. You cannot. We don't leave people behind. That's not negotiable. Avery had heard the steel in Mason's voice, the absolute certainty that brooked no argument. It was the same tone he'd used when the team had voted unanimously to accept her, despite the politics and controversy. The tone that said she was one of them, period, and they would die before abandoning her, which was exactly the problem. Her team would risk themselves trying to rescue her, and Sullivan didn't have time for heroic rescue attempts. He needed a medevac helicopter and a surgeon, not a fighting retreat through hostile territory. Mathematics of sacrifice. Again, Hawk, listen to me very carefully. Avery's voice had been calm, despite the sound of fighters climbing closer. Sullivan has maybe 20 minutes before he bleeds out even with Bradford's intervention. The extraction point is 3 clicks from your position. If you maintain pace, you'll reach it in 15 minutes. QRF can have him in surgery within the hour. Ghost, but if you try to come back for me, you'll have to fight through an alerted enemy force while carrying a casualty. Sullivan dies, maybe others. And I die anyway because you can't reach me in time. We are not leaving you. Yes, you are. Because I'm not done yet. Avery had checked her ammunition, 2 rounds in the rifle, her pistol with a full magazine, and 3 fragmentation grenades. I'm going to move to the North Ridge and draw their attention. That'll give you a clear path to extraction. That's suicide. That's tactics. She'd ejected the damaged scope, reverting to iron sights. I'll find cover, go to ground, after I've pulled them away. You extract Sullivan, get him stable, and then QRF can conduct a proper search and rescue. Silence on the radio, and Avery had known Mason was calculating, his tactical mind running the same math hers had. Everything she'd said was true. The mission had clear priorities: secure the package, evacuate wounded, then recover personnel. Standard doctrine for a reason. How long can you hold out? Mason's voice had been quiet, heavy with the weight of command decisions that had no good options. Long enough. Avery had started moving, low and fast, using the terrain to mask her movement. Ghost out. She'd switched off her radio before Mason could argue further, before his loyalty could override his duty. This was the decision she'd made when she'd joined Team 6 to be the operator who could make the hard calls, who understood that sometimes the mission required sacrifice. Ryan would have understood. He'd made the same calculation in Syria, had volunteered for the patrol that had ended his life because someone needed to, and the mission couldn't wait. She'd been angry with him for years after his death, furious that he'd valued duty over staying alive, over staying with her. Now, scrambling across a frozen ridgeline with enemies closing in, she finally understood. It wasn't about duty versus love, it was about becoming someone who could live with themselves, and she couldn't live knowing she'd chosen safety while her teammates died trying to save her. Ghost wasn't just a call sign, it was a promise. She would be the unseen protector, even especially when that protection required becoming a target. Behind her, flashlights bobbed as fighters climbed the slope. Ahead, the northern ridge offered minimal cover but better escape routes into the mountain valleys. 2 rounds, 1 pistol, 3 grenades, and the absolute certainty that she was making the right choice, even if it was the last choice she ever made. Avery took a breath, steadied her rifle, and began moving toward the next phase of the fight. The Ghost had always known this day might come. She just expected to take more of them with her,